What is humanism?
Though the term humanism wasn't invented until the 19th century. It refers to the rejection of medieval scholastic values and the new embrace of classical thought during the Renaissance. Humanism is also a way of thinking. An important part of humanist philosophy was education that focused on studying history, and emphasized personal ethics and civic values. Renaissance humanism resulted in a new emphasis on individuality. During the medieval period, art and literature tended to be viewed through a divine lens. From the perspective of God. During the Renaissance, by contrast, artists tended to take on a more human-centered view of the world.
What was impressive about the doors of Bishop Bernward?
The splendidly designed bronze doors of Bishop Bernward were built for the Abbey Church of St. Michael's in Hildesheim, Germany. The doors themselves are enormous, over 16 feet tall, and are the first example of monumental bronze sculpture made by the lost wax process since antiquity. Each door was made as one piece, a remarkable technical feat. Considering the complex relief sculpture covering each door. Notable for their masterful metal work, the doors are also impressive due to their complex narrative imagery, which outlines both Old and New Testament events. Each door is divided into 8 panels, each representing a specific biblical scene. A design likely inspired from manuscript illumination.
What is the Ishtar Gate?
The Ishtar Gate was a Neo-Babylonian, double-arched gateway with 4 towers, each featuring notched walls known as crenellations. The Ishtar Gate was originally over 40 feet tall, and the towers rose to nearly 100 feet. The deep blue brick structure was decorated with stylized lions and palm trees, an impressive fortification indeed. The monumental gate mirrored the wealth and extravagance of other Babylonian structures, such as the Hanging Gardens, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate has been installed in a museum in Berlin, Germany.
What is the Ise Shrine?
The Ise Shrine is an important Shinto complex in Japan dedicated to the goddess Amaterasu, ancestor of the Japanese emperors. Known as the Way of the Gods, Shinto may be considered a religion or a philosophy and is indigenous to Japan. Water purification rituals and worship of animistic local deities known as kami are fundamental aspects of Shinto. The Ise complex features a main shrine which has a thatched roof and is raised off the ground with wooden pilings. Made of unpainted cypress wood, the shrine style reflects natural simplicity. Historically, only members of the Japanese imperial family were allowed worship in ISC's interior sanctuary. Every 20 years, the main shrine is completely rebuilt on the site. An important political and religious ritual.
What is neoclassical art?
Sometimes it feels like classical influence never goes away, but in the 18th century, a fully formed classical revival evolved on the heels of the Baroque period. During the 18th century, artists and aristocrats flocked to Rome to see the formidable Roman ruins and the art of the Renaissance. Also at this time, new archaeological discoveries were being made in Greece, revealing more about ancient Greek society and art, and fueling increased interest in classical ideas and aesthetics. The neoclassical style contrasted quite sharply with the flamboyant styles of Rococo, and instead emphasized grand simplicity and stability as well as the noble, heroic ideal. Renewed interest in classical thought inspired more than art and architecture. It also fueled political shifts and philosophical ideas that resulted in dramatic societal changes, such as the French and American revolutions and the rise of Napoleon.
What is art for art's sake?
During the 19th century, there was, and continues to be, a debate about the role and function of art in society. The term art for art's sake was first coined by Victor Cousins, a French philosopher, and reflects the tenets of aestheticism, which is centered on the idea that there is no purpose for art other than beauty. There were some critics of this idea. Karl Marx, for example, thought that art is a reflection of social class and has the power to make political change. The foremost English art critic, John Ruskin, believed that art had both political and social significance and therefore had a purpose more far-reaching than beauty alone.
Why did Louis XIV build the Palace of Versailles?
From 1638 to 1715, King Louis XIV the Sun King reigned over France with absolute power. During his rule, France was the most powerful country in Europe. In the 1660s, Louis XIV made a radical decision to renovate Louis XIII's country hunting lodge and transform it into France's new royal palace, Versailles. This change meant that the aristocrats, diplomats, and all servants would leave the Louvre in Paris and move to the relatively isolated country location. Architects Louis Le Vau and Charles Le Brun oversaw the redesign of Versailles, and the finished building was a massive, nearly city-sized structure with enough space for over 20,000 people. including 14,000 servants. The scale was unprecedented. The Palace of Versailles is an enormous, formidable structure with a severe, classical exterior, manicured gardens, and opulent interiors. Besides any political motivations Louis XIV may have had for relocating the palace, Versailles also served to glorify this powerful king. As the Sun King, Louis XIV emphasized his divine right to rule and his unquestionable power. The king's bedroom was at the center of the palace. He performed elaborate morning and evening rituals that represented the rising and the setting of the sun. The Great Hall of Mirrors, also in the center of the palace, is 240 feet long with 47-foot-high ceilings. The hall gets its name from the hundreds of mirrors and glass panels that inundate the room with sunlight. The vaulted ceiling in the Hall of Mirrors, inspired by Carracci's work at the Farnese Palace, were painted by Charles Lebrun and feature images of classical gods and the military successes of the king. The gardens surrounding the palace were designed by Louis Levat and André Notre. The gardens are made up of pools, monumental sculpture, and thoughtfully planned paths. The formal gardens at Versailles are carefully manicured, further emphasizing the wealth and power of the king.
Who were the Bellini brothers?
Gentile and Giovanni Bellini, members of a highly regarded family of artists, were among the most influential Venetian artists during the Renaissance. Andrea Mantegna, another famous Venetian painter, was their brother-in-law. Gentile Bellini, c. 1430 to 1507, received many high-status commissions from the city of Venice, including decorative work on the Doge's palace, though most of his art has been lost. One painting that has survived is his portrait of Sultan Mehmed II, which he painted as a court painter in Constantinople. His work there highlights the ties between the two cities. Giovanni Bellini, c. 1430 to 1517, is slightly more famous than his brother, and is regarded by some scholars the one of the most important artists of the Venetian Renaissance. He is known for his abilities to manipulate color, space, and form, and completed important Christian-themed works on a monumental scale. In 1478 he painted Virgin and Child enthroned with Saints Francis, John the Baptist, Job, Dominic, Sebastian, and Louis of Toulouse for the chapel of the Hospital of San Job. In this work, Giovanni Bellini masterfully creates the illusion of three-dimensional space as the Madonna and Child sit enthroned within a vaulted apse decorated with Byzantine-inspired paintings and mosaics. Bellini is clearly a master of perspectival techniques, such as foreshortening, and creates a realistic architectural space with rich colors, and attention to detail on par with Northern European masters. The golds, reds, and blues, along with the ornate decoration and use of light, reflect the aesthetic values of the Venetian Renaissance.
What is a lamasu?
A lamasu is a monumental stone sculpture famously part of Assyrian palace decoration, and serves as a protector of the palace gateway. A lamasu combines human and animal features and includes a lion or bull body, wings, a human head with full beard and eyebrows, and a total of 5 legs. When approached from the side, the lamasu appears to be walking, and from the front, it seems to be standing firmly at attention. The lamasu from the fortress of Sargon in the Assyrian city of Khorasabad was constructed around 720 BCE and stands over 14 feet tall. Part sculpture and part architectural feature. This giant creature keeps a watchful eye on any approaching palace visitor.
What is the significance of tattoos for Pacific cultures?
Tattooing was, and continues to be, an important part of cultural and religious tradition throughout the Pacific, especially in Polynesia and New Zealand. The English word for tattoo even comes from the Polynesian word tata. Body art, including clothing and jewelry, as well as tattoos, indicates status, with specific patterns associated with particular ranks within a society. Tattoo designs were usually geometric. The Maori of New Zealand, whose word for tattoo is moko, have separate tattoo styles for men and women. And tattoos of different meanings were placed on different parts of the body. For example, tattoos on the right side of the face represented social status and lineage handed down from the father's side of the family, while tattoos on the left side on the face communicated maternal lineage. Bodies of the most prominent members of society could be completely covered in tattoos. After a period of decline, tattoos are once again being used to communicate status and cultural identity among the Maori of New Zealand.
Who was William Blake?
William Blake, 1757 to 1824, was a deeply religious English printmaker, painter, and poet who disliked the formal training of the Royal Academy and spent his career working on highly imaginative projects, including a series of prophetic books modeled after the Bible, which he wrote and illuminated. Blake did not believe in drawing from life, and naturalism was not his goal. He drew on his imagination for visual cues, and his works are complex, thematic, and often influenced by the style of medieval manuscripts. He created his own mythology that included characters such as Urizen, a name derived from the phrase, your reason, who embodies rationality. In one of his most enduring images, the Ancient of Days, 1794, which is also often called God creating the universe, Blake blends the styles of Michelangelo with medieval iconography to depict the bearded figure of Urizen reaching down from the clouds. his open hand extending into the form of a compass that glows with yellow light from heaven. While Michelangelo's images of God are graceful and all-powerful, Blake conceived of Urizen as a complex, negative force, and his The Ancient of Days is bathed in deep red and dark tones. William Blake's art was not particularly well received during his lifetime, but garnered much critical attention about a century after his death. He is now considered one of the most important English artists in history, a significant romantic artist who felt dissatisfied with the promises of the Enlightenment and the values of neoclassicism.
Who was Bronzino?
Bronzino was the nickname of Florentine artist Agnolo di Cosimo. 1503–1572, who studied under Pontormo, a fellow Mannerist painter. Bronzino's most significant patron was the Medici family, for whom he completed many projects, including altarpieces and frescoes. Today, his portraits are among his most well-known paintings, particularly his portrait of a young man, painted in the 1530s, and now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The identity of the young portrait sitter is unknown, but he is likely a friend of Bronzino's who ran in the same literary circles. Bronzino also wrote poetry. The sitter holds his finger gingerly between the pages of a book, eliciting curiosity about its contents. The well-dressed young man is poised, with good posture and an air of confidence that is only belied by his slightly crossed eyes. He seems to be fully aware of his own superficial airs. He is as much of a mask as the faces carved into the side of the ornate table. This is Bronzino's skill. The artist has an ability to purposefully pose his sitter for the viewer, to make us aware that we can only see the cover, and not the contents of the book.
What is a cromlech?
Translated from Celtic. The word cromlech means circular place and refers to a circle of standing stones. Cromlechs are either circular or semicircular arrangements of megaliths. There are many theories about the function of these large-scale Neolithic sites, including the idea that they served some kind of religious function. However, like the menhir alignments in France, cromlechs remain a mystery.
What is the difference between naturalism and realism?
Naturalism, sometimes confused with realism, is a mode in which an artist attempts to objectively represent the natural world. Artists interested in naturalism spend a great deal of time looking and thinking about the observable qualities of the visual world, while the term realism is sometimes used interchangeably with naturalism, and also refers to art that accurately depicts the visible world. The term is slightly broader, encompassing the sometimes harsh reality of everyday life. Realism, with a capital R, also refers to a series of different art movements including the 19th century realist movement in France, as well as Soviet-era socialist realism.
Who was Raphael?
Raphael, 1438 to 1520. Was 31 years younger than Leonardo da Vinci and 8 years younger than Michelangelo. Very aware of their status and their skill, Raphael made his own place in this pantheon of high Renaissance artists. Whereas Michelangelo was moody and difficult to work with, Raphael was friendly, personable, and well organized. His paintings are characterized by a sweetness and harmony that has been frequently imitated, but rarely, if ever, equaled. Raphael studied in Perugia and had a successful career first in Florence, and then later in Rome, where he was commissioned by Pope Julius II to decorate the Vatican apartments. His most famous works include his Vatican fresco, The School of Athens, 1510 to 1511, and his paintings of the Virgin and Child such as Madonna of the Meadow, which also includes an image of the infant Saint John the Baptist. He painted one major mythological scene, Galatea, in 1512, as well as an influential portrait of Pope Julius II the same year. After the death of Bramante, he was called on as the architect of St. Peter's, though most of his designs were either never constructed, or were changed. Raphael died at age 37 and was buried in the Pantheon in Rome. Why was St.
What is neoclassical architecture?
Neoclassical architecture of the 18th century was a powerful reaction against the highly decorative styles of Rococo architecture, and emphasized logic, symmetry, and geometry in its design. Neoclassical architecture was particularly popular in the design of public buildings, and at least in Britain, private country homes.
What is precisionism?
Precisionism, a term coined by American modernist artist Charles Sheeler, 1883 to 1965, is sometimes also called Cubist realism. The movement began in the 1920s and was an early American modernist movement, characterized by geometric simplification and broad areas of flat, hard-edged color. Precisionist paintings often depict abstract architectural or industrial scenes. The precisionist work of Charles Sheeler, such as Church Street L. 1920, are clearly influenced by the artist's experience as a photographer, and emphasize the man-made world. Other artists associated with Precisionism are Charles de Muth, 1883 to 1935, and Georgia O'Keeffe, 1887 to 1986. Whose works Radiator Building Night, 1927, and City Night, 1926, are good examples of the style.
Who was Andy Warhol?
Andy Warhol, 1928 to 1987, was an iconic artist celebrity whose pop art images of camels, soup cans and film celebrities continue to be highly recognizable and immensely valuable. Popularly known for his bleach blonde hair, dark sunglasses, and turtleneck sweaters, Andy Warhol was interested in stripping mass media images of their symbolic value, thus rendering them anew. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Warhol studied at the Carnegie Institute and moved New York City in 1949, where he began a career in commercial art. He also worked in painting, printmaking, sculpture, and film. Warhol's New York studio, dubbed The Factory, was where Warhol and his team of assistants used silkscreen machines to mass-produce images. His goal was to mechanically produce familiar images until they no longer held any meaning. Like saying the same word over and over until it sounds like nonsense. This explains paintings such as Fragile Handle with Care, which depicts the word fragile repeatedly, until the words become nearly abstract. Similarly, Warhol made an 8-hour-long film of the Empire State Building, created using a single, drawn-out shot. Warhol's work dominated the 1960s art and fashion scene, and he continued to push boundaries into the 1980s, with celebrity portraits and continued exploitation of celebrity.
How are the landscapes of Constable and Turner different?
John Constable, 1776 to 1837, and Joseph Mallard William Turner, 1776 to 1851, were both successful British landscape painters. And yet their styles and approaches to nature were almost completely opposite. After spending some time training at the Royal Academy School in London, but disliking academic convention, Constable dedicated himself to studying nature and searching for truth in his home village of East Bergholt, in the Suffolk countryside. In an attempt to garner respect for landscape painting, Constable's canvases were very large. His painting, The Haywain, Landscape, Noon, 1821, is over 6 feet long, for example. His paintings are clear, detailed, and infused with emotion, which is expressed in heavy clouds, reflective ponds, and glistening foliage, usually calm and pristine. Constable's landscapes offer a subjective image of the manicured English countryside. By comparison, Turner's landscapes are a whirlwind of drama and dissolved images, and present nature as an overwhelming power capable of consuming man and his impermanent structures. Turner is known for his enormous oil paintings, as well as innovations in watercolor, particularly the borderline abstraction of his sweeping brush strokes. Turner's paintings were shocking at the time. His 1842 painting Snowstorm, Steamer Off a Harbor's Mouth, for example, depicts a ferocious ocean storm within with the actual steamer is barely visible, and it is nearly impossible to differentiate between the swirl of dark clouds and the thrusts of the thrashing waves. Unlike Constable's careful, controlled nature, Turner's is a monster.
What is Moctezuma's crown?
Moctezuma was the Aztec leader at the time of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, led by Hernán Cortés. His crown was made of colorful feathers, from birds such as macaw parrots and the quetzal bird, which were gathered into bunches and then sewn into a reed frame studded with precious stones. The long feathers of Moctezuma's crown are dark green and the reed frame is painted in bright reds and light blues. The provenance of the crown has come under much scholarly debate, but there is evidence that the crown was given to Cortés by Moctezuma himself. The crown was sent back to Europe on one of Cortés' ships and given to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The headdress is currently in Austria, and negotiations are underway for the Austrian government to loan the crown back to Mexico for the first time in over 500 years.
What is performance art?
Performance art is slightly more complicated than its name might suggest. Performance art is indeed art that blends music, theatrical performance, and visual art, rather than a single painting or sculpture. But, the form itself, which became more popular in the 1960s, also blurs the line between art and artist, and frequently produces an uncomfortable reaction amongst viewers. For example, the artists Gilbert and George sing for over 8 hours in their performance. The Singing Sculpture, 1969. In a performance piece titled How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, 1968. The often provocative artist Joseph Beuys holds a dead hare in his arms while appearing to whisper to it. A good example of the way in which both art and artist merge is Yoko Ono's 1964 performance Cut Piece, in which audience participants are invited to cut off pieces of Ono's clothing until none remain. This performance is also categorized as an example of Fluxus art.
When did printmaking begin?
By the 16th century, printing technology, such as the woodcut, had been around for hundreds of years, first developing in China in the 5th century. Printmaking was first used to apply patterns to textiles, and then later was used on paper. Intaglio processes, such as engraving and etching, developed in Germany in the middle of the 15th century. Evolved from techniques used by goldsmiths and jewelers. Printmaking allowed artists to make multiple copies of a text or an image. And mass production of prints began in the 16th century, forever changing the consumption of art images and texts.
What is the difference between the art of the many cultures of Africa?
Africa is an enormous continent, and there is huge cultural diversity among the peoples of Africa. Each culture produced art with distinctive forms and styles based on religious beliefs, local materials, and ritual use. The following is a list of selected cultures, their geographic region, and an example of the types of art they produce.
Who was Frida Kahlo?
Frida Kahlo, 1907 to 1954, may have been married to Diego Rivera. But her style of painting was highly individual and eschewed the monumentality of many of her male counterparts who were part of the Mexican muralist movement. Kahlo's autobiographical self-portraits had more in common with miniature paintings, and she was highly influenced by Mexican folk painting. Although not officially considered a surrealist, many of her paintings focus on themes of emotion and psychology through slightly disturbing, dreamlike imagery. Her painting, The Two Fridas, 1939, depicts two seated self-portraits. One dressed in a European-style dress and the other in traditional Mexico clothing. Representing her dual heritage, her father was German and her mother was Mexican. The anatomically detailed hearts of both Fridas can be seen through their chests, each connected with a long, thin blood vessel that wraps around them. The Frida on the left holds a pair of scissors and she cuts the vessel, blood spilling from the tip. This is thought to represent both Aztec sacrifice and the lifelong pain she suffered after a traumatic bus accident in 1925. Other famous works by Kahlo include Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace, 1940, and Self-Portrait on the Border Between Mexico and the United States, 1932.
Who was Hans Holbein?
Hans Holbein the Younger, c. 1497 to 1543, was a leading German painter who went on to become the court painter to English King Henry VIII. Holbein was a skilled realist with great ability to capture texture and fine detail. His work included religious paintings, prints, and even designs for stained glass windows. But he was particularly well known for his portraits, especially his portrait of Henry VIII in 1540. The painting depicts the formidably sized king dressed in his finest clothes against a dark background. The king wears an ornately embroidered coat with yellow, puffed sleeves, fine jewelry, and a feathered hat in celebration of his marriage to Anne of Clovis, his fourth wife. The oil paint captures the rich textures of the fabric and Holbein emphasizes the girth and power of the king's frame. The king's decision to invite a German painter, rather than an Italian artist, to his court highlights the strain between England and Italy after the Reformation.
What is gouache?
Gouache, which rhymes with squash, is a type of opaque watercolor, also known as body color. The opacity of gouache is the result of the addition of glue and white pigment.
Who was Joseph Cornell?
Joseph Cornell, 1903 to 1972, was a self-taught American artist and filmmaker from New York, who experimented with surrealist collage and assemblage, and is most celebrated for his shadow boxes filled with meticulously curated objets trouvés, found objects, which exhibit the artist's eclectic and intellectual interests from astronomy to arcades, from ballet to film. Cornell exhibited his work at the surrealist Julian Levy Gallery, bringing distinction to the art of assemblage. Cornell's boxes have been interpreted as constructivist, and have also been likened to visual poems, filled with surprising, often playful objects. For example, Homage to the Romantic Ballet, 1942, holds 6 frosted glass cubes on a reflective plate above a blue, velvet surface. On the inside of the lid is an inscription, a lyrical telling of a carriage ride on a moonlit night. Another piece, untitled, Hotel Eden, 1945, features a cutout of a tropical bird, whitewashed wood, and paint-splattered newsprint, which creates a nostalgic image of paradise. Many of Cornell's assemblages are on display at the Art Institute of Chicago.
Who was Sinan the Great?
Sinan the Great, c. 1489 to 1588, whose full name was Koka Mimar Sinan Aga, was arguably the most famous architect in Islamic history, designing over 300 buildings, including the Mosque of Salim II, which is considered his masterpiece, also known as the Salimiye Mosque. The Mosque of Salim II was built between 1569 and 1575 in Edirne, Turkey. Sinan designed it when he was almost 80 years old, and his goal was to surpass the great architecture of the previous Byzantine Empire. He created a larger dome than that of the Hagia Sophia from base to crown. The building's interior is a masterwork of mathematical proportion and geometry, fusing an octagon with a dome-covered square, with 4 half-domes in each corner.
Is there such as thing as Impressionist sculpture?
Although he never called himself an Impressionist, the work of highly acclaimed French sculptor Auguste Rodin 18401917 achieves many of the same goals as the work of the Impressionist painters. To capture a sense of fleeting time and capture movement. Rodin's sculpture is characterized by rugged realism and expressive poses. As exemplified in his iconic marble and bronze sculpture, The Thinker. But, Impressionist values can be seen in his controversial sculpture, Monument to Balzac, which Rodin created over 7 years, after a commission from the French Society of Men of Letters in 1891 to commemorate Honoré de Balzac, the French literary giant. This work captures the spirit of Balzac and the monumentality of his creative genius. Like Impressionist paintings, it takes on an unfinished form and emphasizes surface texture. When Rodin shared a plaster model of the sculpture in 1898, it was heavily criticized and the finished bronze and marble cast was not completed until after his death. Despite the initial criticism, the sculpture, and Rodin's overall body of work, is considered to be among the most innovative and significant examples of 19th-century sculpture. And Rodin is credited with foreshadowing modernism. Therefore, not only can Rodin's work be considered impressionist, but it also ushered in a new era of sculptural innovation.
Who was Master Gislibertus?
Although most medieval artisans created their work anonymously, the name of one key sculptor is widely known, that of Master Gislibertus, who worked in the first half of the 12th century. Gislibertus worked on a number of architectural projects throughout medieval France and Burgundy, but is most well known for his contributions to the sculptural decoration of the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare in Autun, France. Graceful, elongated figures and a unique compositional balance characterize his work, which often appeared in tympanums and historiated capitals.
What is the Hagia Sophia?
The Hagia Sophia is a centrally planned church rebuilt as part of a city-wide redevelopment project, headed by Emperor Justinian and his wife, Empress Theodora, in Constantinople during the 6th century. The ambitious design was created by two mathematically inclined architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Mileos, who applied their understanding of geometry, optics, and physics to the project, particularly to the enormous dome, which appeared to float. The result of their work was so magnificent that it was said angels from heaven had miraculously aided the construction. There were concerns, however, about the 40 windows that made up the dome's base.
What is surrealism?
Like Dada, Surrealism was an early 20th century movement that made a major impact on art and literature between the First and Second World Wars. In 1924, French poet André Breton, 1896–1966, wrote the first Surrealist manifesto in which he called on writers to free themselves from the restrictions of rationality and explore creativity through subconscious means, including free association, dream analysis, and automatic writing and drawing. The word surreal suggests the merging of dreams with reality to reveal a superior, more inclusive reality. Breton credited Sigmund Freud with developing the foundations of surrealism in his studies in psychoanalysis. Key surrealist artists include Giorgio de Chirico, 1888–1978, Max Ernst, 1891–1976, André Masson, 1896–1987, Joan Miro, 1893–1983, Man Ray, 18901976. René Magritte, 1898–1967, and Salvador Dali, 1904–1989, among others. The work of the Surrealists is characterized by shocking, often erotic imagery, such as René Magritte's fusion of the nude female form with the face in his oil painting. Elie Wiesel, 1934, and the juxtaposition of surprising, seemingly unconnected elements. For example, Merit Oppenheim covered a cup, saucer, and spoon with fur in her objet. Elie Desgenais and Fourrure, in 1936. Like many other examples of Surrealist art, these disorienting works were inspired by Freudian symbolism and dream analysis.
What kind of art was made in Al-Ifat?
Ile-Ife was the capital of the Yoruba people of Nigeria from the 13th to the 15th century. An era known as the pavement period due to the Yoruba practice of paving parts of the city with rectangular rows of stone and pottery fragments laid out in a herringbone pattern. Ile-Ife was an important center for the arts, and the Yoruba established a long tradition of portraiture, including works in stone, wood, and terracotta, as well as later works in bronze, brass, and other metal alloys made using the lost wax casting method. Portrait sculpture played an important role in ritualistic ancestor worship, and sculptures were often ornately decorated with veils, wigs, crowns, or neck rings, particularly during important ceremonies.
What was the purpose of Emperor Qin's terracotta army?
Accidentally discovered in 1974 in Lintung, China, the massive burial monument for Emperor Qin Shi Huang contains over 7,000 life-size terracotta soldiers and horses, all standing in formation. Each solitaire was painted and assembled from a series of molded parts, and therefore has a surprisingly realistic and individualized look. The burial chamber is as large and grand as the emperor's palace while he was alive, and is part of an ancient Chinese tradition of burying rulers with the wealth and the living staff they possessed during their life, much like the ancient Egyptians. The terracotta army protects the emperor and his material goods in perpetuity, serving their leader even after his death.
What is 19th century symbolism?
The 19th century symbolist movement began as a literary movement in France. Symbolist artists and writers made works that were inspired by dreams, myths, folklore, and the new psychological concept of the unconscious, as described by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. French poets, including Stéphane Mallarmé, Charles Baudelaire, and Paul Verlaine, strived to elevate their work with symbols in an attempt to avoid the limitations of material reality. Gustave Moreau, 1826–1898, and Odilon Redon, 1840–1916, were French artists who embraced symbolism, while the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, 1863–1944, is perhaps the most well-known symbolist painter outside of France. Munch's The Scream is a swirling depiction of intense emotion. Munch wrote about it in a journal, saying, "I sensed a shriek passing through nature. I painted this picture. Painted the clouds as actual blood," as quoted in Stockstad 1050. Other notable symbolists include Belgian artist James Ensor, and the American Albert Pinkham Ryder. Many symbolist paintings are characterized by a dark moods and macabre subject matter.
How did art change in the 19th century?
During the 19th century, the world experienced massive social upheavals due to the Industrial Revolution. The German philosophers Friedrich Engels, 1821–1895, and Karl Marx, 1818–1883, authors of the Communist Manifesto, 1848, believed that the working class, the proletariat, would soon revolt against the bourgeois. Marx in particular was interested in the artist as a member of the proletariat, whose work art was consumed and exploited by the upper classes. Because of the new availability of manufactured goods, handmade items and traditional crafts took on new value. Other important thinkers also affected 19th century perceptions of art, such as Sigmund Freud, 1856–1923, an Austrian neurologist who is credited with founding psychoanalysis, which inspired many artists and writers. The 19th century also saw the rise of the newspaper, and along with it, the rise in the importance of the art critic, whose voice became ever more important in judging and valuing art. Unlike in previous centuries, museums and galleries became important public and business institutions. A change from the previous system of royal or church patronage that characterized art production during the Renaissance. Towards the middle of the 19th century, Romanticism faded and realism became more popular in European art. By the end of the century, the public was shocked by Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, which evolved from realism and, in some cases, a new interest in psychology.
What is the Nefertiti bust?
Nefertiti was the queen of the pharaoh Akhenaten who ruled during the Amarna period, c. 1349 to 1336 BCE. When the bust was discovered in 1912, by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, it immediately captivated both scholars and the public. The painted limestone bust emphasizes the grace and elegance of Nefertiti's face and neck. She appears to be wearing makeup, particularly around the eyes and lips. Her unique blue crown is decorated with a geometric pattern. The sculpture is a testament to the fact that Nefertiti is often considered to be one of the most beautiful women of the ancient world.
What does the earliest Jewish and Christian art look like?
Most of the earliest Jewish and Christian art dates from the Hellenistic period, and takes its cues from Near Eastern and Classical, Greek and Roman, art. Early Jewish artists were forbidden from making any form that could be worshipped as an idol, and therefore avoided representational art. Early Christian art drew its symbols from Jewish tradition as well as classical tradition. A common subject in early Christian art, for example, is the Good Shepherd. In the classical tradition, the Good Shepherd represents the mythological figure Orpheus, who is shown holding a sheep around his shoulders. Early Christian artists used this as a model for early images of Christ in both sculptural and painted form. Referring to Psalm 23, which states, "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I lack," Psalm 23:1. This is an example of syncretism, an art historical term which refers to the merging of meaning and imagery between different cultures and religions.
What is the dinner party?
The dinner party, which first exhibited in 1979 and toured internationally, is a masterpiece of feminist art by artist Judy Chicago. The dinner party is a large work in the shape of an equilateral triangle, a symbol of femininity. Each length of the triangle is 48 feet long and each is set with 13 dinner settings, mirroring the number of place settings at the Last Supper. The 39 total place settings, which were individually designed, Honor 39 important women from history, from Egyptian Queen Hatshepsut to Virginia Woolf to Georgia O'Keeffe. A long, embroidered runner was made collaboratively by 100 women, under the direction of Chicago. And the triangle-shaped heritage floor, made of ceramic, includes the names of 999 women. The dinner party highlights the often forgotten role of women in history and celebrates women's creativity and artistic traditions. The piece is not without controversy, however. Some have criticized the work for its narrow scope, saying it communicates a predominantly white, heterosexual experience, among other things. Regardless, the dinner party makes a powerful feminist statement and is perhaps Judy Chicago's best-known work.
How did the art of Spain influence art in the New World?
Starting in the 16th century, Spanish culture began to dominate Central and South America as Spanish conquerors destroyed native temples and missionaries worked to convert native populations to Catholicism, sometimes forcefully. By the 18th century, Catholicism in Latin America had become infused with native beliefs, which directly inspired new styles of art and architecture. An example of this fusion can be seen in the nearly 12-foot-tall atrial cross from the Basilica of Guadalupe in Mexico City, which was made sometime before the 1560s. This large, stone crucifix was hung in the church's atrium and was decorated by native artists commissioned by Christian missionaries. The cross decoration blends images associated with Christ, such as the crown of thorns and the Holy Shroud, with Central American symbols of the Tree of Life. The atrial cross was a common decoration in parts of the church where new native converts were introduced to Catholicism, and the decoration of the cross at Guadalupe underscores its function as a visual marriage of cultures and beliefs.
Where can I see art in my area?
Art is all around us, especially if you are looking for it. Be sure to check out local galleries and museums, which usually have both permanent collections and temporary exhibitions that change regularly. Cafes, bookstores, and frame shops also often hang original art by local artists on the walls and sometimes have talks about art. These are great places to meet other people who are interested in art, especially during the summer months. Arts and crafts fairs and festivals are frequently held in downtowns, parks, and fairgrounds. Search online or stop in at your local arts and crafts store, gallery, or cafe, which might have some information on upcoming art events. I want to learn more.
What are the sappy salt cellars?
Sappy salt cellars, made of ivory, were a result of Portuguese trade relationships with artists along the coast of West Africa. The Portuguese commissioned luxury goods such as spoons, forks, decorative boxes, and salt cellars. At the time, salt was itself a luxury good that only the rich could afford. And an exotic, carved salt cellar was a symbol of wealth. Art historians have identified what they think are three individual sappy carvers who produced much of the work. The styles of the salt cellars are a blend of African and Portuguese influence, mixing Christian imagery and European hunting scenes with royal iconography familiar within the Benin art historical tradition. In a way, the sappy salt cellars are the first example of tourist art in Africa, as these were objects created with the intention of exporting them.
What was the Harlem Renaissance?
The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that grew from the 19th century New Negro movement. Intellectuals such as Alain Locke, 1886 to 1954, called on black artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers to draw inspiration from their African roots rather than white European traditions. Blues and jazz, played by musicians such as Bessie Smith and Duke Ellington, and poetry by writers such as Langston Hughes, were part of a cultural explosion that centered on the New York City urban experience. Visual artists, including the photographer James Van Der Zee, and painters Palmer Hayden, 1890 to 1964, and Aaron Douglas, whose painting aspects of Negro life, from slavery through Reconstruction, 1934, is an example of the influence of African art styles on black artists during the Harlem Renaissance. The painting represents the history of black Americans, and is populated with figurative silhouettes reminiscent of ancient Egyptian paintings. With a limited color palette, Douglas' painting is filled with energy, movement, and sound in its depiction of the Emancipation Proclamation, Civil War Reconstruction, and voting rights. At the far left of the scene, the Ku Klux Klan threaten on horseback. But repeating circles draw attention to a triumphant figure at the center, who holds a ballot in his hand.
What is Art Deco?
Art Deco is a term that describes a style of decorative arts popular during the 1920s and 1930s, though the term was coined later. Art Deco, originally called Style Moderne, began in France and gained prominence after the Exposition Internationale d'Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, an art and design expo held in Paris in 1925. Art Deco is characterized by the merging of fine arts with decorative arts and emphasized new support for the craftsman over the factory. Art Deco objects, illustrations, and buildings are often highly ornamental, something that was criticized by other modernist designers and writers, such as Le Corbusier, who favored a more industrial aesthetic. There are often exotic elements in Art Deco design. Inspired by the discovery of King Tut's tomb in Egypt in 1922. Abstract movements such as Cubism and Futurism also inspired geometric motifs associated with Art Deco.
Why did Monet paint Rouen Cathedral so many times?
Monet was fascinated by optical realism and painted multiple, over 30. Canvases 184 of the facade of Rouen Cathedral as an exploration of the properties of ever-changing light and the perception of light by the human eye. Imagine looking across a bright street with squinted eyes, trying to make out the buildings on the other side. With its niches and varied textures, the church facade was a perfect subject for such experimentation. In the intense sunlight, Rouen Cathedral loses detail and its physicality dissolves. Since the sun is constantly moving through the sky, the light reflecting off the building is constantly changing, and Monet attempted to capture the fleeting quality of this light in his work, which is also responsible for the unfinished style. Monet embraced the aesthetic value of the quick sketch, though he meticulously worked on these pictures in his studio at Giverny. And he hoped to capture this in his series of paintings of Rouen Cathedral.
What is the Renaissance?
The word Renaissance is a French word meaning rebirth. The Renaissance is generally considered to be a rebirth of classical, Greco-Roman, culture, which resurfaced after the dark days following the fall of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. This, however, is an oversimplification. Changes such as the development of cities, a growing European economy, and strong support for the arts by wealthy patrons all contributed to the birth of the Renaissance. The balanced, harmonious, and naturalistic paintings associated with the Renaissance did not burst onto the art and culture scene of Europe overnight. It happened slowly over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries. Beginning in Florence, Italy, and was at least partly inspired by a newfound interest in translating classical Greek manuscripts, and the study of Roman ruins.
What is Murillo's Immaculate Conception?
Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, 1617–1682, was an important Spanish painter based in Seville whose art emphasized images of the Virgin Mary and the saints, and was painted according to rules set out by the leaders of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which specified the manner in which the Virgin Mary could be depicted. Murillo painted multiple different paintings of the Immaculate Conception, including the Immaculate Conception of the Escorial, c. 1678, which conforms to these rules. The Immaculate Conception is a Catholic doctrine, not fully accepted as dogma until the 19th century. Stating that the Virgin Mary was born without original sin. In Murillo's painting, Mary is clothed in blue and white and she appears suspended in a glowing heavenly space surrounded by cherubic angels. Her face looks upward, her hands are held in prayer, and her feet gingerly rest upon a delicate crescent moon. An image derived from Revelation 12:1, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, as quoted in Jansen 696. The delicate sweetness of Murillo's paintings influenced Spanish painters in the New World for nearly 200 years.
What is a cantilever?
An example of a cantilever is a balcony that projects from the side of a building, supported on one end by a vertical form, and freestanding on the other. A cantilever may seem as if it is freestanding, but is not. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright used cantilevers to dramatic effect in his design for Falling Water, a home in Pennsylvania.